Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this second talk in J.B. Andersen's new series, John Adams, A New Look at Our Second President. Our topic today, the title is Tom Paine Publishes His Famous Pamphlet and Adams Takes It Badly. Today's speaker, historian J.B. Andersen, has long been a very popular speaker at our history talks. JB's appearance today is made possible through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, with financial support from the Ramsey County Library Friends organization. We are deeply grateful to both these groups. Thank you very much. And now let me turn things over to our speaker, J.B. Andersen, for this second talk in the John Adams series. Thanks very much.
Last week, there was a question that we didn't get to about the Sons of Liberty. So I'm starting here with, I think it's 6 or 7 slides on the Sons of Liberty to answer that question. It was founded in 1765, so this is 11 years before the beginning of the American Revolution, and it was founded by the man pictured here, Samuel Adams. And it's known as a paramilitary group, meaning it's not fully armed, but and it's not a function of a state group someplace. And it was also political in nature. They had ideas about what they thought separation from England should look like after it occurs. Their major goal was to get rid of the British, make them look bad, undermine their rule. And they were the group that initiated the Boston Tea Party also. They basically organized the lower classes, so were the people that, had the least benefit from British rule. They included sailors. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean military sailors. It can mean sailors on merchant ships also. Dock workers, artisans, that's people who made things, apprentices, servants. There was a leadership group in the Sons of Liberty known as the Loyal Nine, basically people nobody's ever heard of, but they were very instrumental in creating the American Revolution. John Avery, Henry Best, Thomas Chase, Stephen Cleverly, Thomas Crafts, Benjamin Eads, Joseph Field, John Smith, George Trott. If you want to look up any of these people, feel free to write to me, and or just simply, I can send you a list of the names so you know what to look for. There's been a couple of, there have been tons of interesting books written about the Sons of Liberty. One of the most popular has been Karen Palumbo's Sons of Liberty, Men Who Changed History, on the right. On the left, the revolutionary Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams, by the way, was a cousin. I think it was a second cousin to John Adams. They ended up having groups in every colonial city. Some of the things they did is they burned taxpayers, or they burned tax collectors in effigy. The graphic here shows an even worse fate. They tar and feather them. If you're tarred and feathered, you die from it. Your body basically cannot breathe. You cannot release things through your skin. Unless you got next to someone who had a solvent for the tar, you were a dead person. They insulted tax collectors publicly. The offices that tax collectors did their work out of were burned, demolished. They attacked the homes that the tax collectors lived in. There was also a Daughters of Liberty organization. Their logo is shown on the right there, and a colonial woman with an American flag motif behind below. They were the people that would go to daily markets, get food, etc., so they could boycott British goods, buy only from people they knew to be colonial vendors or people not selling British goods. And they resisted British policy. Some became, came to own guns, and even during the American Revolution, became cannon attendees. After the American Revolution, there were still some problems that people felt needed to be solved. The leadership of the Sons fell to these three gentlemen: Isaac Sears, upper left, and Marinus Willett, upper right, and John Lamb, lower right. And you can see both Lamb and Willett were military people. They worked primarily out of New York City. And in March of 1784, now this is a year after, there'd been no battles after 1781, but the Treaty of Paris between the United States and England was 1783. So this is a year after the treaty ends the war. And they were very angry about people who remained in the United States who were loyalists. Now, during the American Revolution, you had people who were patriots. Those were people who joined with the revolution, fighting for the colonies, for independence from Britain. Then you had loyalists. Those are people that remained loyal to Britain. Many of them fled into Canada that Britain controlled. Well, what about the ones that stayed behind? The Sons of Liberty at this time were calling for the expulsion of these loyalists, get them out of the country. Now we can talk again about Adams, but I'd like to make a couple comments. There was a concern about first ladies and doing more on first ladies. And I had wondered about doing that, but the university had a person teaching first ladies, and so it would have been in conflict with that course. I do include some information about first ladies occasionally when I'm doing the presidents. And I thought it would be an interesting course to teach, but my time's limited also. Doing one course here keeps me kind of busy during the week. I thought another interesting course might be women who have run for the presidency, and that started in the 1870s. And there have been many of them in the last 150 years. And there's been talk about, for instance, here, I have text in the slides and a graphic. And occasionally I'll get an evaluation that says, all he does is read from slides. Number one, I wrote the slides. And number two, remembering stuff, paying attention to it, gaining an interest in it. If it's a person speaking, like a professor standing up in front of a class, there's been research done on this. Speaking alone, 3 days later, you get a test. About 30% are correct in the answer, in the total number of questions asked. If you have a graphic and if you have text, that goes along with it. 3 days later, 70% of the questions are answered correctly. And I tend to add things occasionally along the way. So that's the reason for some text and some graphics. So Adams moves to Boston. He'd been living in Braintree, Massachusetts. You can see on the upper map here that that's a little bit south of Boston itself, south and east. And then there's a larger map of the entire state of Massachusetts showing the port city of Boston. Now, Braintree, it's just 13.5 miles south of Boston at the time of Adams living there. That's about a 3-hour ride on horseback, about 12 minutes today. He had hoped that by moving to a larger city, he'd get more legal business than he did in the small town of Braintree, which certainly happened. And then he was in Boston at the time of the Boston Massacre trials. We'll talk about the Boston Massacre in a few minutes. First, what was getting people active here in the colonies? What were things they didn't like? We're going to talk about the Townshend Acts. This is Charles Townshend. He was a member of Parliament, introduced some bills, and he became Chancellor of the Exchequer. In the United States, that's like being the Secretary of the Treasury. And these Townshend Acts basically replaced the Stamp Acts. Stamp Act we talked about last week, and it was a set of taxes. Anything you did required that you purchase a stamp, and that would make it a legal document. And when the Stamp Acts then were withdrawn, just a bit more than a year after they'd been passed, the Townshend Acts were passed as a replacement and not much different. Goods that were taxed, British-made dinnerware. So dinnerware from, say, China, for instance, wasn't taxed, but anything made in Britain was. Lead. Lead was used commonly throughout the colonies and all around the Western world. It was used to hold the stained glass together, so you could have individual chunks of stained glass, and then you'd weld them together with lead, which, of course, melted at a very low temperature. This tax was also placed on glass, paper, paint, and tea. And tea is the thing that brought in most of the money. There were 4 uses for this tax money now that was being collected by the Townshend Act. One was, instead of the colonies paying judges, the British would pay the judges. That made the judges more loyal to British authorities. And the hope was this would cause them to decide cases that were favorable to the British, not to the colonies. And it called for enforcement of laws. Anyone selling things without having paid a tax, for instance, or any laws that the British saw as unfavorable. This device seen here, it's being held in the lower left. You would run that around a person's neck, and it would be difficult to get out of, although you could. And it was a painful situation, but it also kept the miscreant away from you. They couldn't start slugging at you, or etc. It's called a catch pole. Some were far more sophisticated than the one that we just saw. Oftentimes they were spiked. Here you can see at the top of this catch pole up here. This is hinged. So when you push it around a person's neck, whoops, this will slide down. Then once a person's in here, they pop up again and the person cannot get out. So it's far more effective a device than that simpler one we saw in the last slide there. Yeah. And being spiked on the interior, it really caused a total lack of movement by the person you were man-holding there. Also, New York State was the most outspoken about British controls, and these taxes were aimed largely, this Townshend Act, at New York State. One of the things New York State refused to do, which was very costly for the British, was to quarter troops. Now, quartering troops means that you take a British soldier to a resident's home and you say, this man is going to stay here. You provide him with bedding and food and drink. Quartering of troops is outlawed by the United States Constitution. But here, when the British were in charge of the colonies and the colonial peoples had no rights, they couldn't vote in Britain, for instance, in British elections. And this was an expensive operation for them, for residents. Colonials needed to pay taxes. People needed to be informed of this. So this act also said, we're going to hang posters or paste posters on the sides of buildings. We're going to have people walking through towns, and they will say, you have to pay taxes. Britain has a right to tax you. You're a British colony, etc. This Townshend Act simply created even greater tension between the colonials and the far-off British rulers of the colonies. Let's take a look at the Boston Massacre of 1770. This graphic on this page shows on the right of the graphic a group of British soldiers firing into a protesting crowd of colonials in the city of Boston. First, we're going to talk about the incident. Notice here in the middle, being fired on by British is a black man. British soldiers were attacked. They were standing in the streets, guarding streets, etc. And British soldier attacked one of them, stepped back, you're getting too close to us. And that riled a crowd in the area who started throwing rocks at the British troops. The British troops then lined up and fired into the crowd. 5 colonials were killed, 5 were wounded. One of those killed was a black man, Crispus Attucks, picture shown here. He was a free black man living in Boston and protesting with the colonials against British authority. British soldiers were arrested and charged with these murders, probably an effort to quell further disruption in Boston. The defense of these British soldiers. Nobody was interested in defending them. I mean, what kind of a reputation would you gain among your fellow colonials? Well, John Adams was a guy who had been outspoken about everyone deserving a defense. So he came forward and he said, I'll defend these British soldiers who shot into the crowd. Well, the trial was delayed by 8 months. The British, hoping that a long delay like this, at a time in our history when trials usually took place rapidly. Here we are waiting 8 months, hoping people will forget or hoping people will calm down. Now, Samuel Adams, pictured here on the left, who was the founder of the Sons of Liberty, and Paul Revere on the right, the famous silversmith, they kept things alive. They spoke out about these killings by the British troops and attempted to keep people aware that there had been difficulties and the trial would be coming up in a few months. The officer in charge of the British troops at the time is pictured here. His name is Thomas Preston, and he had the rank of captain, and he was acquitted. Many people testified, including himself, saying, "I never ordered troops to shoot. I had nothing to do with it." Consequently, he's acquitted, found not guilty in these killings and shootings. Now, Adams criticized about his defense here. Several objections. One was the British packed the jury, and they had a lot of businessmen in there, and Adams wasn't objecting enough to this. Now, the reason these colonial businessmen were, why is that a concern? Well, they were dependent on trade with Britain. They were dependent on the British bringing in goods that they would then sell in their stores. So they would favor Britain, you would think, in this situation. Second thing is that indeed, after when the American Revolution began, 5 of these former jury members became loyalists. They proclaimed their loyalty to Britain. They did not side with the colonies in the Revolution. 3 months after the trial, Adams ran for political office. Now, the reason he did that is he'd gotten lots of attention. His name was recognizable. You'd think he might suffer from this, but Boston was a place where there was lots of sympathy for the protesters. So Adams was elected, and he was elected to the Massachusetts legislature. So he was operating in the state of Massachusetts. His office gained a lot of business because of this in Boston, which is why he had moved there. But the notoriety kind of outpaced the fact that he'd been defending British soldiers. And a lot of the business he got was from the loyalists who saw him as someone who defended British soldiers. Consequently, he may be a loyalist himself. There's a book by the famous historian Thomas Fleming, pictured here, about the loyalists and who they were, what they did, etc. It's estimated about 1/3 of the people in the colonies were loyalists. About 1/3 were patriots to the colonial cause. They were anti-British, and about 1/3 didn't care. It really depended. A lot of people say that the patriots were in a majority. Some say the loyalists were not really a majority, but a plurality. Adams was paid by the defendants. It really wasn't the kind of pay that he would have gotten. I mean, he was going to do it for nothing, but the men being charged were able to gather a small sum of money from their comrades and were able to give Adams a bit of a fee. Adams on protesting. Now, there's lots of protesting. I mean, it's what the Tea Party was about. It's what this shooting in Boston was about in 1770. Adams publicly stated he did not like to see violence, was not an advocate of violence, but he did see the British as acting irresponsibly. And he maintained this attitude during the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, and the greater positioning of British troops into the colonies. British started paying colonial judges. This is when Adams really got angry. He was an attorney. He went, these judges are now biased in favor of Britain. It's where their money's coming from. The stability of holding their jobs as a result of British authority. They do something the British don't like, they'll be fired and replaced with somebody who does what the British command them to do. So biased judges favoring Britain, that really got Adams involved as a revolutionary. The British Parliament then passed an order that said, we are in absolute control over the colonies. You do not have control there. Okay, let's talk about the Boston Tea Party. First, we're going to talk about the event. Look at this graphic. You can see people wearing Native American headdresses. Many were dressed as Native Americans, but they were European in ancestry. This occurred on December 16th of 1773. A total of 10,000 pounds in 1773 money was destroyed in tea, by the tea being rifled through. By inflation today, that's about $2 million. So you can see it's a sizable chunk of money. The graphic here is a 3-pound note in the state of Virginia. We got rid of pound notes, but not till Thomas Jefferson did it. And Jefferson said, I want a 10-based system. So he had $1, it's got 100 cents in it, it's got 10 dimes. The British system was, you'd have a farthing and there's 12 of those, and a pence and there's 20 of those, and a pound. I know I don't have that accurate, but you get the idea. It's 12s and 20s, and it's not 10 and 10. The weight of the tea that was destroyed was about 92,000 pounds. That's 46 tons. And this tea was on 3 different ships that were in the Boston harbor. And some of the tea was thrown into the sea. That's kind of become the common belief. But you could destroy tea simply by cutting open its wrapping. And most of the tea that was destroyed was left on board, but cut open, exposed to the air and the humidity, etc. The Tea Act. Let's talk about that. It had 3 provisions. It was passed by the British in May of 1773. This is 7 months before the Boston Tea Party, and it's one of the major causes. It is the major cause. This was a tax on tea, but it had been in existence since 1767. So that's 6 years before the Boston Tea Party. But there was a new Tea Act was passed, and it was advertised about the tax on tea. Let's take a look at the 3 provisions. Tea can be shipped directly to the colonies. Okay, you had tea coming from the Orient or Asia. Orient is a French word. The Asians don't like it being used in reference to Asia. So this was tea coming out of Asia. It would have to stop in Britain and it would be inspected. And in Britain, you would pay the duty for taking that tea to the colonies in the Americas. Now, this new Tea Act said, okay, you can go directly to the colonies. We'll have people there. It'll save you time, distance, etc. And you can pay the tax there. Second, the agents for selling tea were appointed by the British now. Nobody could go to the port and say, I want to buy 80 pounds of tea and take it back to their shop. You now had to be approved by the British. It was British citizens that got the approval, and they were the only sellers of tea in the colonies. And as you can see, children drank the tea. The amount of tea consumed at this time in history is just startling, even almost up to the present day. And the third provision of the Tea Act was there'd be no new tax on tea in the colonies. Well, they'd been taxing it for 6 years already, so the tea already existed, the tax already existed on tea, so the heck with it. The British East India Company. This was created by Parliament. It was a private company, but they were the company. They were a monopoly. You are the only people that can, only British people that can bring tea back from Asia. And you can be the only sellers of tea in the colonies of Britain. They came to have some financial trouble. At least that's what they were telling British authorities. Allowing shipment to the directly to the colonies throughout the Americas was one way the British government tried to save them some money. But they also gave them aid. And for those of us in the United States, this giving money to corporations from the federal government should sound very familiar. Here are brief recent history of United States bailouts. 1989, there was no crisis in business, but businesses were given bailouts of $293 billion. In 2008, at the end of the George W. Bush administration, was just about the worst recession in our history. Many economists are calling it the Lesser Depression. It was a banking crisis. That year, $498 billion was given in bailouts by the US government to United States corporations. In 2010, again, no crisis, $475 billion. In 2020, $2.2 trillion. And this was based on the COVID crisis. Now, some people might be asking, well, why is he talking about this? Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting to do when you study history is to compare it to present day circumstances. Is any of that sort of thing going on today? Well, these bailouts certainly are. So this isn't anything new. Boston Tea Party, going to talk about reactions and from three different groups: from the colonial people, from the owners of ships. Now, these weren't all British owned ships, British government owned ships that were involved in trade. There were private small shipping individuals or groups that would be involved in trade also, ship owners. And we're going to look at John Adams's reaction to the Boston Tea Party. First, how is this any different than any of the other acts passed by Parliament that we don't like? that create a tax for us, such as the Stamp and Townsend Acts. So the Tea Act is seen unfavorably by the colonials. The British, and especially ship owners who were British, wanted the smuggling to stop. 86% of all tea coming in to the colonies in the Americas was smuggled in, mostly by Holland. So the people from Holland would go to Asia and they would bring back tea and they would deliver it to an area not heavily populated and then move it on land. And that's just a gigantic amount of smuggling. 86% of all tea in the 1770s was smuggled. The graphic here is a poster saying, hey, we saw a ship near here. We think it's smuggling. We'll give you 500 pounds to anybody who can tell us where this ship is, etc. And you can see it down at the very bottom. It's dated October of 1782. So the American Revolution has not yet been resolved diplomatically. Ship owners, they worried that they'd be blamed by the East India Company, the British East India Company, for the Boston Tea Party. Now, see, the British East India Company would tell a private ship owner, you go to Asia, you pick up tea, and you bring it back to us, and then ship it to the colonies or take it directly to the colonies. We will pay you thus and such for doing that. So that's what they did. So on many of the shipments of tea coming into the colonies was on board private ships, not ships owned by the British East India Monopoly Company. And British East, a lot of these ship owners who were private, who lost their cargo, felt that the British East India Company is going to blame us for this loss, and they're going to not pay us, or they're going to tell us we even have to pay for the loss. So these private ship owners asked John Adams to defend them. John Adams refused. He told the ship owners, no, not going to help you out. You're in cahoots with the British monopoly. Boston Tea Party was a good thing, Adams said. And of course, again, it was his cousin that had led it. So his attitudes are changing. He still believes that everybody deserves a defense, but a company isn't an everybody. It's not a person. Now, recently, within the last, maybe 10 or 15 years, Supreme Court, maybe it's 20 years ago, the Supreme Court has stated that corporations are a person and they have the rights of a person. Next thing we're going to talk about is the coercive acts. And here you see a graphic of a family in their home, and the British have come in and said, this is a soldier you must care for. So let's take a look. Introduction. What's this thing about? It was a British attempt to fight back for the Boston Tea Party and what had happened during the Boston Tea Party, and they needed additional troops in the colonies to prevent this from happening again. So they sent a lot more soldiers over to the colonies here in present-day United States. And the colonies nicknamed the coercive acts, they called them the intolerable acts. They were aimed mostly at Massachusetts, the state shown here in the graphic, and particularly at Boston Harbor. I have an arrow pointing to Boston Harbor, which was the major import spot for the Northeast United States, and it's where the Boston Tea Party occurred. Now, these coercive acts, they were really 5 different acts, and we're going to take a look at each one of them. There is a Boston Port Act, an Administration of Justice Act, Massachusetts Government Act, a Quartering Act, and the Quebec Act. So the Boston Port Act, what are its elements? Port of Boston was closed down by this act, and it was due to the Boston Tea Party. Nobody can deliver anything into the Port of Boston. Boston was loaded with merchants, with shops who no longer could get supplies or not get them as easily. They'd have to cross over land from maybe as far south as Philadelphia. All damages from the Tea Party had to be paid. This is $2 million. So the colonies, especially Massachusetts, are being asked to divvy up lots of money and pay for the losses. The responses to the Boston Port Act. King George III appointed a military governor to Massachusetts. He had been appointing, I mean, the royalty of Britain had been appointing governors of all the colonies in the present day United States. But now he appoints a military person to be the governor, indicating, this is kind of like an act of war against the colonies, especially against Boston. So the colonies then became worried about a military governor starting martial laws. Martial laws could include, nearly a soldier nearly on every street corner, watching what you do throughout the day, a curfew. Nobody can be out on the street from 6 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, for instance. Further actions by individuals and groups that took place. This is General Thomas Gage. He is a British general stationed in the colonies, and he closed down an additional port. He saw to it that Boston was closed down as Parliament required, but he also closed down the port in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And again, merchants very worried about their supplies. Merchants form an organization that lots of non-merchants joined also, kind of like the Sons of Liberty, except they corresponded in writing mostly. And they were called the Committees of Correspondence. And the merchants start pressuring colonial governments to pay these damages. If you don't pay these damages from the Boston Tea Party, we're going to go out of business. And they also then state that they would like to see protesting stopped, because that's giving us lots of economic difficulties with the British. Now it started to get more radical. Samuel Adams, founder of the Sons of Liberty, moves in, and he's the guy that was responsible for the Boston Tea Party. Today we have a beer named after him, shown there in the graphic. A total of 80 towns in Massachusetts set up committees of correspondence who were trying to negotiate with their local governments, their state governments, and with the British about resolution of expenses, taxes, so forth. By 1773, all 13 of the colonies in North America had committees of correspondence that in some way or another were attempting to deal with Britain and with their local colonial governments, either concerning, hey, don't pay for the Boston Tea Party, or let's get it paid for and move on. After a while, there was a bit of conflict within the committees. Nothing was happening. So the committees of correspondence, now located in each colony, said, we want all the colonies to come together for a meeting. This was the first colonial Congress, all the colonies coming together for a meeting. These committees of correspondence were the social media of the day. And they couldn't be shut down as easily as social media can. They could do mailings. The British could check their letters and what's in them, but they could also put a guy on a horse and he could ride for 3 days. Somebody else from that place could ride for 3 days, and they're all carrying verbal messages, which is much more difficult to deal with. So there were further actions by individuals who didn't want to join a group or who wanted to act alone, didn't like what was being said by the groups. And there were further actions by the groups also. Boston Town Meeting was called, and it denied merchants' demands. Merchants are demanding that the colonies pay the British for these losses. This is the building where Boston Town meetings were held. The Boston Port Act, let's take a look at the effects of it. Well, the British were hoping for division among the colonies. That didn't work. These committees of correspondence rose up all over. There was some division within them, but nonetheless, they were a pretty effective group in working against the British. They really added to the cooperation among colonial citizens. Other colonies would ship stuff into Boston, and by ship, I mean it'd come by land, wouldn't come by sea. And that would give a great deal of relief to the merchants, but also to the people who were dependent on the merchants for goods. So a lot of cooperation developed between the colonies and against these British actions. That's the analysis of that act. The second act we're going to talk about, it's part of the coercive acts, is the Administration of Justice Act. How are we going to punish these colonials? That's the question the British were asking. How can we suppress protests in the colonies, and mostly Massachusetts? That's where the greatest amount of difficulty for the British was centered. So punishment for the colonials. Okay, somebody gets arrested. We're not going to try them in the colonies. We're going to ship them to England, and we'll try them here in home territory. That dealt with charges of murder. Of course, the Sons of Liberty were, a group like the Irish Republican Army. They were tarring and feathering people, which led to death. They were hanging British agents, so on and so forth. And if a person charged with murder was not taken to England, they would be taken to another colony where they may not have the same degree of support that they did in their home base. Next act is the Massachusetts Government Act. Founding document of Massachusetts is flawed, according to many, so they want a whole new situation, and they create a new legislature there. This is the British now. This is the Massachusetts Government Act, and they say it's the British saying your government is flawed. We get to take it over. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony is ended, and it becomes a colony where the legislature is now controlled by Britain from abroad. They engage in this control by allowing the king to appoint the legislators for Massachusetts. That way the people aren't electing them, and they'll be more responsive to the needs of Britain. Governor of each colony, who is appointed by the king and always has been, that governor can now appoint all the judges, attorney general, sheriffs, court officers. The courts will be controlled by people who are beholden to the British. So the governor is appointed by the king. This is the rule of the few. And it's called an oligarchy by the people in the colonies who are opposed to it. A lot of people argue the United States has been an oligarchy. We've had 2 presidents named Adams. We've had 2 presidents named Bush, 2 presidents named Roosevelt, 2 presidents named Harrison, all of them related to the person with the same last name. And most of our presidents have been people of wealth. 32 of them have been military. 31 were officers. 1 was a private. 32 out of 45, that's like 2/3 of all presidents have had military experience at the level of an officer. A third possibility is any appointed official can be removed at any time. If we don't like what you're doing, you're out of work. If you're living in the colonies, go home. If you come back to Britain, fine, come on back. But we're going to appoint somebody else because you did something unfavorable to us. The Massachusetts Government Act says no more town meetings. They were having town meetings regularly, and they would schedule additional town meetings in a time of crisis. Now, this law says you can have 1 meeting a year. And that has to be a meeting that's declared by the governor, who's appointed by the king. So too many abuses in town hall meetings, so we'll stop the town hall meetings. And towns can no longer pass laws. The governor will tell you what the laws are in your local community. The Quartering Act, we've talked about this in the past. You can see here in the graphic, there's a family who's waiting hand and foot on a British soldier. That way the British government doesn't have to pay for huge barracks, meals, sleeping quarters, etc. Something happens to your uniform, sew this up, lady. This applied to all the colonies, these Quartering Acts, housing and feeding of soldiers. There were some towns where there were soldiers and there weren't enough houses and family units to take care of all the soldiers. But there were, most towns had abandoned buildings. So the abandoned buildings were taken over, and the townspeople had to see to it that food was delivered there and that bedding was appropriate, etc. So there became a rather than quartering in your home, there was quartering in a village town, but you were still responsible to the basic and daily needs of the soldiers. The Quebec Act, final one. The map here shows the province of Quebec in green. Look in the lower left there. There's a red line. But that whole area, look, that's around the Great Lakes, and it's green. It's part of Quebec. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's present day Quebec with the arrow pointing toward it, the green place in eastern Canada. More than half the Canadian population is located in Quebec, and it's a French-speaking area. My relatives, my mother was from Canada, from Alberta, this province here, AB, and that's primarily British, all those Western colonies, and they, to this day, hate Quebec. When I've been up visiting cousins, they speak negatively about the French and in Quebec and the control they have, because that's where most of the population is. So this area is, but now at this time, French have moved in. French were early settlers here. They'd move in there for fur trapping, but the British took it over. So it's now controlled by the British. And here, Quebec owns this chunk of what present day United States, that includes the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And you can see in the upper right a portion of Minnesota. So dealing with Quebec, this Quebec Act is important because it controls the Great Lakes area. The Quebec Oath, now that's required of all residents in this area. And it talks about the Protestant faith, but it's a Catholic area. And they removed references to the Protestant faith. You want to live in this area, you're a Catholic. Open practice of the Catholic faith was pronounced. You can openly be a Catholic. And tithing is required. That's 10% of your annual income must be donated to the local Catholic Church. French laws, once the British took the area over, were in conflict with British law, but they're going to coexist in these two areas. Claims were made that land owned in the colonies are part of Canada. Okay, you got a British citizen. He owns land in the 13 colonies. This Quebec Act says that land owned by a British citizen is a part of Canada. And as a result of that, they said in those areas we can broaden religious and legal matters. What's the impact of all of these acts? For the colonies, they felt like we're losing freedom. The British people have lots of freedoms. We aren't considered British subjects. We think we deserve those same conditions. You are overlords, not a government that we can elect and unelect, etc. Colonial self-government will disappear. It's already in the process of disappearing. The governor's been appointed by the king, but now even further down kinds of jobs are being placed under the control of the king. The Ohio Territory, which we talked about, that was those 5 states, including a portion of Minnesota. That's a part of Quebec. It's not just a colony, another colony of Britain. It's now a part of Canada. The question then for colonials became, what about the land we own up there? George Washington had owned, he was paid for fighting wars up there by the British by being given land in Ohio. Does Washington still own that land? Soldiers were given land in that area during a war that we fought in that, what was a Northwest Territory, those 5 states. What happens to the land there? British citizens, their land in the colonies is owned by Canada. What about our land in this new Canadian properties of Quebec? Catholicism is established as the official religion in Quebec. What happens to religious organizations that are not Catholic in nature? What happens to British religious organizations inside the colonies? Do these British-owned areas all have to be Catholic also? Well, the colonists get very disturbed by all of these 5 acts. Leads to the formation of this first Continental Congress that meets in September of 1774. So, First Continental Congress, we're going to talk about the founding of this organization. It was called for by Samuel Adams, again, the head of the Sons of Liberty, a violent group trying to get the British out of the colonies. And he wants this meeting that will be political in nature to talk about British laws within the colonies. They meet in Philadelphia, of course, with no British approval. The meeting is in the fall of 1774. It lasts for 52 days. That's 7 weeks, 1 month and 22 days. Massachusetts sent 4 delegates to this Philadelphia meeting. Sam Adams, head of the Sons of Liberty, was one of them. His second cousin, John Adams, was another. So 2 of the 4 delegates are members of the Adams family. The Grand Committee. This was a committee that was appointed by the First Continental Congress. And there were 23 people in it. So there's a couple people basically from each of the colonies. And John Adams was appointed to this Grand Committee. The Grand Committee's responsibility was to write a letter to King George III. I've placed a letter in quote marks here because there were people who said, okay, this needs to be a nice, kind letter. And there were people that were saying, we need to scream at this king. So what's going to happen? Many wanted a statement of loyalty to England. We appreciate you. We are loyal to you, but we need to be treated differently. And here's some of the changes we want. But they were saying to their fellows on this Grand Committee that this letter should be kind. We don't want to stir up more action, get more British troops hauled over here. Just talk about recent British laws that are difficult for us. John Adams supported this loyalist group in the committee, the Grand Committee of 23 members. And when a letter was written and had harshness in it, he fought to get those harsh statements removed. However, most of the people in Philadelphia from the 13 colonies disagreed with these loyalists who were attending this convention. And the letter ended up being more accusatory in nature. And it was based on the Suffolk resolves. If you look at the upper map here, Suffolk County, it's that yellow county with the arrow pointing to it. They passed Suffolk resolves, which were very critical of the British. Now, the lower map shows the area where Suffolk County is located. You can see it's a pretty small colony there among the surrounding counties. Boston is located in Suffolk County. Let's take a look at the Suffolk County resolves. Massachusetts state government is forced to accept the rule of Britain. There's no way we're going to do this. Massachusetts was punished greatly because of the Boston Tea Party and other reasons. So the Suffolk resolves rejected this. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, also said, we don't want British rule. The boycott of British goods until those 5 coercive acts are repealed will continue. Suffolk County resolves, we want all British appointed officials to resign. We want all tax payments to Britain to end. So you see, this is pretty radical stuff. They're really talking about the British getting out. The British have to support colonial administrators who are elected by colonials, and they have to do that in all the colonies, not just Massachusetts or other places where you might have a big agreement or disagreement. And the colonies must all be allowed to raise militias. These are military groups made up of individuals. They'll defend the colony, the local areas, the counties, etc. This was not allowed under British rule because these people would be armed and ready to shoot on British soldiers in the area. The Suffolk County resolves were delivered to the Continental Congress from Massachusetts by a very famous person who supported them, Paul Revere, the silversmith. We think of Paul Revere as a guy that hung a couple lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea, and he was a silversmith. Fact is, he was a radical colonist supporting most of these notions, including separation from Britain. Other county resolves. I've got a map of Minnesota here with the 67 counties of Minnesota all outlined. But in the colonies, those 13 colonies, there were other counties who made resolutions also, not just Suffolk County. Mecklenburg County here in blue in North Carolina had the Mecklenburg County resolves. Basically, they said, we're not going to obey any British laws within this county. Tryon County of North Carolina, here's a marker that shows the county. It's been divided into 2 and has different names today. But they sent a resolution to Britain that said, we're going to resist all British actions. The entire colony of North Carolina told Britain, we are independent from you. This is the first document to declare independence from Britain, and it came out of the colony of North Carolina, future state of North Carolina. Side note, I accidentally put 2 O's into colony, so it was colonials And I got this picture. And it's the same guy made up differently. And the title of it was Coloonies. I also got this picture. It's a back of a Canadian dollar with the bird, a loon on it. And the Canadians, I go up into Canada, my Canadian cousins all call it, it's a loonie. How are we doing for time here? Gee, the whole title for today was Common Sense, and I've just gotten to it. But can I?
You've got about 15 to 20 minutes more, but really, I would like you to do the title, piece, the common sense piece. I was going to ask that as a question if you didn't talk about it. So
I'll run
why don't
through
you go
this,
ahead?
and sure. And if I don't get it finished here by 10:02, I'll start it over again next week. Sorry about that. This is a pamphlet that was published in support of the colonies. And it was written by Thomas Paine. It's a very famous part of the American Revolution. And it was written during that first Continental Congress. And it has 4 basic items that he deals with. We're not going to attempt to look at them here. I've got them printed out in typeface in a couple of slides. But one thing that's interesting about them is there's an F where an S belongs. And during the colonial period, this F was seen to be a stylized S. And you might also notice here, perfect state, and it's PRE, not PER. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a side note. I've already talked about the F's and S's and the misspellings. During most of history, written history, boy, if you could spell stuff differently, that showed you were very creative. We have 6 surviving signatures of William Shakespeare. He spells his last name differently in each one of them, seen as a sign of creativity. Spellings had not yet been standardized at the time of the American Revolution and during the lifetime of John Adams. So what was it that led to the standardization of spellings? It was Noah Webster, pictured here. He published the first dictionary in 1828. Here he is again. And in 1824, he had published this book about here's how you should spell words. And everybody should be doing it the same. And this can be used in schools. So here's the cover of the famous Common Sense pamphlet. 4 items discussed. What should a government look like? How should it be designed? Monarchies and hereditary succession. And of course, there's opposition to that. What is going on in the American colonies? And what is the prefect or perfectibility of America? So let's take a look. Abolish monarchies is the first thing that Paine talks about. Even constitutional ones. Britain has a constitutional monarchy. The royalty is for display only. And Paine says, we don't even need that. A lot of people argue for this today. They say the job of a president is so enormous that can't these functions like dinners and stuff fall to a second president who's in charge of the dinners and walks, museum visits, etc. Unicameral legislature is argued for by Thomas Paine. Paine says that when the United States is formed, it should be a single body. not two bodies. Well, we ended up with a House of Representatives and a Senate. All the blue countries across the world that are bicameral, they have two houses in their legislative branch. You can see it's a majority of nations across the country. Orange is unicameral legislatures. Green, I can't find a green one on here. That's unicameral with advisors. And one black country, Saudi Arabia, has no legislature. Payne argued for a weak executive and that executive should be elected by the legislature, not by the people. I don't get this. When a weak executive implies a weak execution of government, and you know what we're up against. So a single body, a unicameral legislature is what Payne wants. This is like Britain. It's a parliamentary system. The parliament they're all elected from local areas. They get together and from among themselves elect a prime minister who's the head of government. John Adams objected to this pamphlet. He didn't like it. Adams had three major objections. He says it's about minority rule. The people aren't involved in enough of the elections. The people don't get to elect anybody on a nationwide level, only within their local community. And the pamphlet by Payne has nothing in it about individual rights. There's no checks and balances within this government. It's just a single entity. Adams was favored, you got a House, a judiciary, and executive branch, and they all balance each other out. They control each other. You got a single parliament, and it appoints the head of state. You don't get any of that. Monarchies can be used for ceremonial purposes. Payne wanted monarchies abolished. Adams argued for them. As a matter of fact, when he was president, he required people to call him Your Highness. Here's the Obamas visiting Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. She's 5'1", Obama's 6'2", and you can see Prince Philip isn't very tall either. Adams' objections were published in a pamphlet by Richard Henry Lee, a founding father relative to Robert E. Lee of the Civil War fame. Adams didn't want his name on this document, even though the ideas were his, so there's no mention of him. But the document's called Thoughts on Government, and it's a response to Payne's common sense pamphlet. It was the ideas of Adams that made the Constitution. It was not the ideas of Payne. And that is the end of common sense. Next week, we'll talk about the adult life of John Adams after 1776. Everything we've talked about so far has been up to 1776. So, okay.
Okay, well, we do have some questions and not much time, so I'm just going to go straight into the questions and we'll see how far we get. First question. My sources, this person says, say tar and feathering is not typically fatal, just humiliating. Maybe you want to check on that for next time?
That is stated by lots of people, and it was an attempt at kindness to some degree, but it certainly could lead to death.
Mm-hmm.
You can see what's going on. The entire body's covered in tar. The body sweats. The body gives off gases. The body sheds dead skin. these are all things that cannot be done when it's
Yeah.
covered with a substance like tar.
But apparently, I guess there was more access to solvents than we might have
Yeah.
suspected, at least according to some
Now,
sources.
I agree. I've seen both of these arguments. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next was a comment. Your comments on the superiority of speech and text over speech alone. I think they're talking about images. I think you're talking about your slides. This person says, it's exactly correct. You are doing fine.
Thank
So,
you.
okay. Where did the tea in the Tea Party come from? Where did it come from?
Well, it's because tea was, the current day Tea Party.
No, I think they meant, the tea that they tossed overboard during the Boston Tea Party, where had it started? Where had it come from?
Well, I think the fact that they were throwing tea overboard and they made
Uh-huh.
it sound like they were having fun. So it's called the Boston Tea Party. It was not people sitting down at a party and drinking tea. It was
No, but where did the actual tea leaves, where had they started? Where were they brought from?
I see. I'm sorry. I'm not absolutely certain, but I think the origin of tea is in China.
Uh,
And
would
it's
that be the Indian East Orient Company that would?
Yeah, but it's grown throughout Asia.
Okay.
And it's the major drink there. There's many varieties of it. So it
Yeah.
came out in Asia, and really wasn't tea in Europe until the sailing ships could get to Asia and return. Now, to some extent, there had been trade, and it was on the land. And there's a very long trade route that went to the Mediterranean area, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, from China, and known as the Silk Road. Not because they were carrying tea, but because everybody loved that cloth, silk. So they carry silk, and it'd be I think it was about a 2-year round trip journey. But tea came out of the area of Asia.
This next commenter underscores the Chinese thesis. She says, I own a wooden Chinese tea box. It came from my great aunt, belonged to my great aunt, and my great aunt, I guess, was related to my father, who came from the Boston area. So maybe that would underscore the idea that the tea in the Boston Tea Party came from China. The next comment is, it's really the person is giving the British, the earlier British money system before the Brits also converted to, now there are 100 pence in a pound, but originally this person says 4 farthings equaled 1 penny, 5 pennies equaled 1 shilling, and 20 shillings equaled 1 pound. And I know that shillings to pound is correct, but I'm not sure about the 5 pennies to 1 shilling. Do you know about that?
No, easy thing to look up.
Okay. All right.
Anybody that's interested in that, just look up the old pound system in Britain.
Yeah. And I remember the old pound system was in effect at least until 1970, because that was my first trip to Britain and they used the old money. Okay. Let's see. Were any of the soldiers in the Boston Massacre convicted?
No, well, yes, they were, but they had a choice. They could serve a prison term or they could be branded.
Yeah.
So they all chose branding. So a branding iron was taken out and the back of their hand was branded. And so forever, people could see that they'd committed some criminal act. And frequently the branding, the logo of the branding would indicate the crime that had been committed.
Yeah. Okay, let's see, who actually owned the tea being imported at the time of the Tea Party? Who lost the revenue? Did Britain lose more than the tax from the ruined tea? So
Sure.
who took the loss on the tea that was dumped overboard,
Well, it was
essentially?
virtually all property of the British East India Company,
Mhm.
although it was delivered on ships they didn't own in many cases.
Yeah, yeah. And then finally, one comment, it's a little hard to explain, but remember when you were showing the slides with the elongated S that looked to modernize like an F, and you showed an example, you said, well, this was an example of misspelling, that the word was perfect and it was misspelled. Actually, could that word have been present? Couldn't it seemed like the phrase read the present in the present state, and a number of text or questioners have asked about that. Maybe we could go back and look at the slide at some point.
Sure. Yeah, I think that might be correct, that I was
Okay.
looking at that wrong. Yep. Good
Okay.
eye.
All right, well, I think that is the questions for today. Let's see if there's any others here. So just one question about Tom Paine. Was he in the colonies when his famous pamphlet came out, or was he always in Britain?
No, I think I don't know. He spent the remainder of his life, I think. I can look it up in France or
Oh, okay. Because he couldn't go back to Britain because he was persona non grata. Yeah.
I think, I don't know if he was in the colonies at the time he wrote that or not, but
Oh, I see. So maybe he never was in the colonies. Is that possible?
well, he spent a lot of time in Europe.
Yeah, yeah, right. All right, and finally, a comment. This person says, yes, we've certainly seen the end of common sense. Ha, ha. So I think on that note, we're going to have to end our talk for today. We're out of time. So thank you very much, J.B. Andersen. Thank you, Grayson and Carmi behind the scenes. Thanks to the audience, particularly the person who came up with the last end of common sense remark. And please come back again next week when we're going to talk about Adams fights for liberty and quarrels with Jefferson. But until then, I'm going to say goodbye for all of us. Thank you.